April 6, 1945, East China Sea, 280 miles southwest of Kyushu, 14:37 hours. The Grumman TBF Avenger banked hard to starboard as Lieutenant Commander John Bridgers rolled the aircraft into its attack run. The late afternoon sun, glinting off the torpedo, slung beneath the bomber's belly like a steel predator waiting to strike. Through the windscreen, the massive silhouette of the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, cut through the Pacific swells, her 18-inch gun silent now, her escort scattered by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft that had descended upon the fleet like metallic locusts. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray filled the cramped cockpit, and beneath the roar of the Wright R-2600 Cyclone engine, Bridgers could hear the rhythmic breathing of his radio man and turret gunner in the compartments behind him, their lives bound to his decisions in these next crucial seconds. The sound that dominated this moment was not the engine's thunder or the whistle of wind through the radio mast, but rather the steady electronic pulse of the radar altimeter clicking away the diminishing distance between the Avenger and the sea surface. Drop too high and the torpedo would tumble uselessly, too low, and the aircraft would cartwheel into the waves that were now close enough to see individual whitecaps. The TBF Avenger had been born from catastrophe and refined through blood. When Japanese torpedo bombers devastated the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy possessed exactly one operational torpedo bomber worth its salt, and it was British. The Douglas TBD Devastator, the Navy's frontline torpedo bomber, in December 1941, was already obsolete when war began, a relic of 1930s aviation technology facing 1940s combat realities. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American torpedo squadrons flying Devastators had been slaughtered. 41 of 42 aircraft from 3 squadrons were shot down in attacks that achieved no torpedo hits and virtually no damage to Japanese carriers. The men who flew those doomed attacks went to their deaths knowing their aircraft were too slow, too vulnerable, and too poorly armed to survive in the skies above modern naval task forces. Squadron commanders had written letters before the battle expressing their awareness that flying the Devastator into combat was likely a death sentence. The few survivors spoke of watching their squadron mates disintegrate under Japanese fire, of flying through storms of anti-aircraft shells and Zero fighters that picked off the lumbering torpedo bombers like a hunter shooting tethered ducks. The Grumman TBF Avenger arrived in the Pacific just days before Midway, too late to save the men who died in Devastators, but in time to begin writing a different story. 6 Avengers participated in the Midway battle, and 5 were shot down, a grim introduction that might have suggested the new aircraft was simply a faster coffin. But those who studied the combat reports saw something different. The Avengers that were hit had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed Devastators instantly. The single Avenger that returned to Midway had taken multiple hits, but had kept flying, had brought its crew home alive, despite damage that testified to the aircraft's robust construction. Grumman's engineers had designed the Avenger with lessons learned from early war combat: self-sealing fuel tanks that didn't explode when punctured, armor protection for the crew, redundant control systems, and a structural integrity that kept the aircraft flyable even when damaged. The Avenger was not perfect, no aircraft is, but it was survivable in ways its predecessor had not been, and in naval aviation where carrier-based torpedo bombers had to penetrate intense defensive fire to deliver their weapons, survivability was the difference between a combat capability and a suicide mission. Japanese naval officers who encountered Avengers in combat reported something they had not experienced when facing Devastators: respect mixed with frustration. The early war torpedo attacks by American forces had been characterized by what Japanese combat reports described as inadequate aircraft and poorly executed tactics. Devastators approached slowly, in straight lines, at low altitude, presenting perfect targets for Japanese anti-aircraft gunners who had plenty of time to aim and fire. But Avengers came in faster, maneuvered more aggressively, and proved harder to destroy. More significantly, Avengers carried a weapon that actually worked, the Mark 13 torpedo that, after extensive redesign following early war failures, had become reliable and deadly. Japanese ships that had survived multiple Devastator attacks untouched found themselves taking torpedo hits from Avengers, and the psychological impact of facing effective American torpedo bombers transformed Japanese defensive calculations. What had been a relatively simple defensive problem, shooting down slow, vulnerable aircraft before they could launch, became a serious threat requiring dedicated resources and tactical adjustments. The sound that came to symbolize the Avengers' effectiveness was not the roar of its engine or the thunder of its weapons, but rather the distinctive crack of a torpedo's warhead detonating against a ship's hull far below the waterline, a sound that transmitted through water and steel to announce that American naval aviation had delivered another killing blow. Each torpedo hit represented the culmination of industrial and tactical evolution. The aircraft that delivered it, the torpedo that functioned as designed, the crew training that enabled accurate drops under combat conditions, and the tactical doctrine that positioned the attack for success. The Avengers' combat record would ultimately claim more enemy tonnage sunk than any other Allied aircraft, over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping sent to the bottom by torpedoes, bombs and rockets delivered by these robust, unglamorous workhorses of carrier aviation. Lieutenant Commander Bridger's attack on Yamato exemplified how far American naval aviation had advanced from the desperate days of 1942. The aircraft beneath him was a TBF-1C, upgraded from the original model with better avionics, improved armament including forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns in the wings, and most crucially, the Mark 13 Mod 9 torpedo, a weapon that could be dropped from higher altitude and at higher speed than earlier versions, reducing the time the attacking aircraft spent in the kill zone of defensive fire. The tactical approach Bridgers employed had been refined through 3 years of combat experience. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm defensive gunners, altitude variation to complicate fire control solutions, and precise timing to ensure torpedoes arrived at the target simultaneously from different angles, making evasive action impossible. This was not the chaotic desperation of Midway, but rather the methodical application of proven tactics executed by experienced crews in aircraft capable of delivering their weapons and surviving to fight again. The development history of the TBF Avenger reflected American industrial capacity mobilized for war. Grumman had begun design work in 1940, incorporating requirements based on European combat reports and on the Navy's recognition that the Devastator was inadequate for modern warfare. The prototype first flew in August 1941, and production orders were placed immediately, despite the aircraft still being in testing, a calculated risk that reflected American industrial confidence and strategic foresight. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, the first production Avengers were already rolling off assembly lines. By war's end, nearly 10,000 Avengers had been produced by Grumman and General Motors, the latter operating under license at a dedicated facility that demonstrated American manufacturing flexibility. The production rate peaked at over 400 aircraft per month in 1944, a tempo that ensured every American carrier could field full torpedo bomber squadrons and that losses, both combat and operational, could be replaced without diminishing frontline strength. The Avengers design embodied practical rather than elegant solutions to the challenges of carrier-based torpedo bombing. The aircraft was large for a carrier-based plane, with a wingspan of 54 feet that required innovative folding wing mechanisms to fit on carrier hangar decks. The internal weapons bay could accommodate a Mark 13 torpedo or up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, providing versatility that allowed the Avenger to serve in multiple roles: torpedo bomber, level bomber, glide bomber, and eventually with rocket installations as a ground attack aircraft in the war's final phases. The crew of 3, pilot, turret gunner, and radioman, bombardier ventral gunner, could maintain defensive fire in multiple directions, with the power-operated dorsal turret mounting a .50 caliber machine gun that provided coverage against fighters attacking from above and behind. The radioman operated a .30 caliber machine gun in a ventral position that could engage surface targets and provided some defense against fighters attacking from below. The aircraft's robust construction was not accidental, but reflected Grumman's design philosophy, developed from early war experience. The company's earlier fighters, the F-4F Wildcat, had earned a reputation for bringing pilots home despite battle damage, a characteristic that Grumman engineers deliberately incorporated into the Avenger's design. The airframe used thick aluminum skin in critical areas, redundant structural members, and was designed with damage tolerance that allowed the aircraft to maintain flight control even when portions of wings or control surfaces were shot away. Pilots reported returning to carriers with damage that should have been catastrophic, control cables severed but with backup systems still functional, engines hit but continuing to produce power, fuel tanks punctured but self-sealing features preventing fire. This survivability translated into crew confidence and tactical flexibility. Avenger crews could press attacks closer to targets, could maintain course through defensive fire, and could execute the kind of aggressive tactics that were suicidal in less robust aircraft. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners who faced Avengers learned to respect the aircraft's toughness and to adjust their tactics accordingly. Japanese combat reports from 1944-45 noted that American torpedo bombers no longer fell from the sky as easily as they had in early war engagements, that hits that should have destroyed attacking aircraft merely damaged them, and that American torpedo attacks had become significantly more effective as both aircraft and tactics improved. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was measurable. The knowledge that American torpedo bombers could survive defensive fire and deliver their weapons created anxiety that affected morale and defensive effectiveness. Japanese sailors who had survived torpedo hits described the terror of watching Avengers boring in through defensive fire, seemingly unstoppable, their torpedoes dropping at the last possible moment to run true toward the ship's hull. The Mark 13 torpedo that the Avenger carried deserves its own recognition in the story of American naval aviation's transformation. Early war American torpedoes were disastrously unreliable. They ran too deep. Their detonators often failed, their gyroscopes malfunctioned, and their drop requirements were so restrictive that aircraft had to fly slow and low into defensive fire that made successful attacks nearly impossible. The torpedoes' failures were so comprehensive that some American submarine commanders preferred to conduct surface gun attacks rather than risk wasting torpedoes on weapons that might not explode even when they hit. The Mark 13 went through extensive redesign between 1942 and 1944, with modifications that improved drop characteristics, fixed the depth-keeping problems, replaced the faulty detonators, and added features like ring stabilizers that allowed drops from higher altitude and speed. By 1944, the Mark 13 had become a reliable weapon that functioned as designed, and the combination of reliable torpedoes and capable delivery aircraft transformed American torpedo attack from a desperate gamble into a tactical capability that Japanese forces had to respect and defend against. The sound of a torpedo detonating against Yamato's hull, the deep, resonant boom that Bridgers heard even over his engine noise as he pulled away from the attack, was multiplied by dozens of hits as wave after wave of Avengers delivered their weapons against the massive battleship and her escorts. The attack on Yamato represented the apotheosis of American naval aviation's development arc, coordinated strikes by hundreds of aircraft from multiple carriers using proven tactics with reliable weapons flown by experienced crews in aircraft capable of surviving the mission and returning home. The battleship that had been designed to be unsinkable, that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering and the embodiment of battleship-centric naval doctrine, was being destroyed by aircraft that cost a fraction of a single one of Yamato's main gun turrets. The symbolic significance was not lost on participants on either side. The age of the battleship was ending, and the instrument of that ending was, in large measure, the Avenger and aircraft like it that had shifted naval warfare's center of gravity from the gun platform to the aircraft carrier. The versatility that made the Avenger the war's most effective torpedo bomber extended beyond pure torpedo attacks. As American strategy shifted from defensive operations to island-hopping campaigns, Avengers found new roles supporting amphibious assaults. Loaded with bombs instead of torpedoes, Avengers conducted close air support missions, striking Japanese defensive positions, bunkers, and troop concentrations with precision that artillery could not match, and with responsiveness that ground commanders desperately needed. The Avenger's internal weapons bay allowed it to carry significant bomb loads while maintaining relatively clean aerodynamics, and the aircraft's stability as a bombing platform, a consequence of its size and weight, made it effective in level bombing and glide bombing roles that smaller, lighter aircraft struggled with. Late war modifications added rocket rails that allowed Avengers to carry 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVAR, weapons that were devastating against ground targets and small ships, and that transformed the Avenger into a multi-role attack aircraft capable of engaging virtually any target the Pacific War presented. The transformation in American carrier aviation between early war desperation and late war dominance can be measured through the Avenger's operational history. At Midway, American torpedo attacks had been suicide missions that accomplished little. By 1944, coordinated Avenger strikes could cripple Japanese task forces, destroy merchant convoys, and support amphibious operations with a reliability and effectiveness that American commanders took for granted. This transformation was not solely about the aircraft. It reflected better pilot training, improved tactics, reliable weapons, and the systematic institutional learning that American military culture excelled at when given time and resources. But the Avenger was the platform that enabled and embodied this transformation, the aircraft that gave American naval aviators the tool they needed to execute the mission of projecting power from carriers across the vast distances of the Pacific. The crews who flew Avengers, pilots, turret gunners, and radiomen, developed intense loyalty to an aircraft that brought them home alive. Avenger crews spoke about their aircraft with an affection that combat airmen reserve for machines that they trust absolutely, that have proven themselves under fire, that have absorbed punishment and kept flying when crew lives depended on it. The Avenger was not glamorous like fighters, not sleek or fast, but it was dependable in ways that mattered more than performance specifications. The trust that Avenger crews had in their aircraft translated into tactical aggressiveness and mission effectiveness. Crews that trust their aircraft will press attacks harder, will maintain course through defensive fire, will execute the mission even when conditions are difficult, because they believe the aircraft will get them home if they survive the run. Japanese naval officers who studied American carrier aviation noted the Avenger's effectiveness with professional respect and strategic concern. Japanese analysis of American naval operations identified the Avenger as one of the key weapons that had shifted the carrier war decisively in America's favor. Japanese planners recognized that they had no equivalent aircraft. Japanese carrier-based torpedo bombers were generally faster and more maneuverable than the Avenger, but were more fragile, carried less capable weapons, and were produced in numbers insufficient to maintain operational effectiveness as attrition accumulated. By 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had been essentially destroyed as an effective force, and the battles that had produced this result featured Avengers prominently in attacks that sank Japanese carriers, destroyed their escorts, and eliminated their combat capability. The statistical evidence of the Avengers' effectiveness is overwhelming. Over the course of the war, Avengers are credited with sinking more enemy tonnage than any other Allied aircraft type. Estimates exceed 1 million tons of Japanese shipping destroyed, including battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and merchant vessels. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Avengers participated in strikes that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force, sinking carriers and decimating their air groups in combat so one-sided that it marked the effective end of Japanese naval aviation as a strategic threat. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Avengers helped sink the super battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, in attacks that required multiple torpedo and bomb hits over several hours, but that eventually overwhelmed even that massive ship's damage control capabilities. The Avengers' success was not without cost. Nearly 700 Avengers were lost in combat during the war, and operational accidents claimed additional aircraft and crews. But the Avengers' loss rate was significantly lower than earlier torpedo bombers, and more importantly, crew survival rates were higher because the aircraft's robust construction gave crews better chances of surviving battle damage and making it back to the carrier or ditching near-rescue forces. The difference between a 90% loss rate like Devastators suffered at Midway and a loss rate of perhaps 5 to 10% in later war, Avenger operations was not just statistical. It represented the difference between unsustainable attrition and an acceptable casualty rate that allowed combat operations to continue while maintaining squadron effectiveness and morale. The sound of torpedo detonations, that recurring acoustic symbol of American naval power, was heard throughout the Pacific as Avengers methodically destroyed Japanese naval and merchant shipping. Each detonation represented not just the destruction of a single ship, but the systematic interdiction of Japanese logistics, the severing of supply lines that connected Japan's empire to the resources it needed to sustain the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, raw materials from Southeast Asia, food from occupied territories, all became targets for American submarines and aircraft, with Avengers accounting for a significant portion of the merchant tonnage sunk. The cumulative effect of this campaign was to strangle Japanese war industry and to ensure that even ships and aircraft that survived combat often could not be kept operational due to lack of fuel, spare parts, and munitions that could not be transported safely to where they were needed. The attack on Yamato on April 6, 1945, represented the final validation of American naval aviation's transformation and the Avengers' role in that transformation. The largest battleship ever built, designed to be the ultimate expression of naval gunpower, was destroyed by aircraft that cost a fraction of what the battleship cost, operating from carriers that could project power across distances that the battleship could not match. The Avengers that participated in the attack, there were dozens in the successive waves, that struck Yamato and her escorts, delivered their torpedoes with the professional competence of crews who had trained for exactly this mission, using tactics refined through years of combat, with weapons that functioned reliably, in aircraft that could survive the defensive fire and bring their crews home. Of the hundreds of American aircraft that attacked Yamato, only 10 were lost, a testament to both American air superiority by this stage of the war and to the robust design of aircraft like the Avenger that could absorb damage and continue fighting. The epilogue of the Avenger's combat service is that the aircraft remained in service well after the war, continuing to fly with the U.S. Navy and Allied air forces through the 1950s. The design proved adaptable to new roles: anti-submarine warfare, airborne early warning, cargo transport, demonstrating the inherent soundness of the airframe and the quality of the engineering that had gone into its creation. But the Avenger's most significant legacy is not its post-war service, but rather its wartime accomplishment. It was the weapon that gave American carrier task forces the capability to project lethal striking power against enemy shipping that enabled the carrier to replace the battleship as the capital ship of naval warfare, and that sank more enemy tonnage than any other aircraft of World War II. The Avenger was not the most famous aircraft of the war. Fighters captured public imagination, and heavy bombers conducting strategic campaigns against Germany drew more attention. But the Avenger did its job with unglamorous effectiveness, and its job was to sink ships, to project American naval power across the Pacific, and to help win the war against Japan through the systematic destruction of Japanese naval and merchant forces. The sound of torpedo detonations that marked the Avenger's attacks echoes through naval history as a reminder that effective weapons are not always the most sophisticated or the most celebrated, but rather the ones that accomplish their mission reliably, that protect their crews adequately, and that can be produced and employed at scales that make them strategically significant rather than merely tactically interesting. The Avenger accomplished its mission thousands of times over 4 years of war, bringing its crews home alive more often than not, sinking ships that Japan could not afford to lose, and contributing decisively to American victory in the Pacific. The best torpedo bomber of World War II was not the fastest or the most elegant, but it was the one that sank the most ships, survived long enough to matter, and earned the trust of the men who flew it into combat, knowing that their lives depended on their aircraft bringing them home. That aircraft was the Grumman TBF Avenger, and the sound of its torpedoes finding their targets was the sound of American naval aviation coming of age, of industrial capacity translated into combat effectiveness, and of a weapon system that did exactly what it was designed to do: win the war at sea by sinking the enemy's ships until victory was achieved and the last torpedo had been dropped.